Metro Exodus was released to favourable reviews in February 2019. Studio 4A Games had been working on the Metro formula since the studio's formation in 2006, with the release of Metro 2033 and Metro Last Light. The games are based on a series of books by Russian author Dmitry Glukhovsky. Exodus is the culmination of a decade's work, but also a new direction for the franchise. I haven't played the first two games and knew very little about Exodus coming into it. I've now played the Enhanced Edition through twice on both PS5 and PC. Exodus has become one of my most memorable games of recent years. I want to share some of what makes it special. Spoiler warning, I've used early to mid-game footage and won't be talking about specific plot points. That said, the base game has been out for more than 2.5 years, so I'm going to give myself some leeway. I submit to you my review of Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition. The Metro games are known for their eponymous setting, the Moscow Metro. The first two games take place for the most part in underground tunnels. Linear single-player experiences, they mix FPS and stealth gameplay loops with light-duty crafting and survival elements. Metro Exodus is both an evolution of and a departure from this formula. It begins with our protagonist, Artyom, climbing down into the metro tunnels once again. A familiar setting, but it's an elegant misdirection. Your expectations are soon confounded as you leave behind the confines of the Moscow underground for good. The titular Exodus is an epic train journey across post-collapse Russia. The train is home to Artyom and his fellow special forces known as the Spartans. It's also integral to the story, moving us through the world's distinctive biomes with our ragtag band on their search for a new home. I want to start with 4A Games' ambition for this project. The studio produced a 3-part making-of series for YouTube, which I've linked in the show notes. From the get-go, you can see the emphasis on narrative.
We already have a lot of experience with Stalker, which was mostly open world oriented. And when we finish this project, we feel that we want more power on this narrative-driven gameplay to put this atmosphere of Stalker, of this abandoned beauty, and fill it with some very great narration.
I think to best understand Metro Exodus, you need to frame it in this context. Above all, 4A is trying to tell a great story, and it starts with the environment. From the opening moments, the destruction on display tells the story of nuclear devastation almost a quarter century earlier. The surface is cracked, entire inland seas emptied and valleys flooded. The lighting immediately stands out. The Enhanced Edition is a significant technical achievement. Digital Foundry did a tech-focused video on it, linked in the show notes. It's one of the first AAA games to feature a completely ray-traced global illumination pipeline. Unless you compare side by side with the base game, you might not immediately notice the difference. Your brain kind of just processes the whole thing as surprisingly realistic. If you do compare, you'll notice perhaps how much better interior spaces look, the contrast between shadow and light, the realistic shadows cast by furniture, the way surface colours affect the hue of ambient light. The impact of ray tracing on reflections is more obvious. Unlike cube maps, they remain visible even when the geometry casting them is off-screen. 4A Games and the Metro franchise come from interesting roots. In 2006, 3 developers from Ukraine-based GSC Game World left to start their own studio, also in Kiev. They had been part of the core team on Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl, which would release the following year to critical acclaim and, later, cult status and 2 sequels. The Stalker games are considered classics for their game world, their compelling environmental storytelling and aesthetic, inspired in part by the 1972 Russian novel Roadside Picnic. While the book is concerned with the aftermath of an alien visitation, the games begin with a fictionalized retelling of the 1984 Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Metro's calamity is also nuclear, but I think there's plenty of other shared context.
The last century was a very harsh environment for all people living on this territory. So empire collapses, a bunch of revolutions, fought for independence. All these combined events create all this beauty of ruined landscape, ruined buildings, old rusty harbors, abandoned villages, and broken roads. This is like part of a soul, nothing you can forget. This is what we try to show, finding the way to show the people the beauty of destroyed world in the art of the game.
Both the Stalker and Metro franchises are a response to and an exploration of 20th century Ukrainian experience, including but not limited to the Chernobyl disaster. Ukrainians still live with the aftermath of that disaster, the 20,000-year exclusion zone. Chernobyl embodies some of our worst human instincts: hubris, arrogance, greed, violence, opportunism. This is fertile ground for storytelling, and those are themes that you see time and again in both franchises. The environmental art design of Exodus is of a piece with the world of Stalker. Both games in fact share a creative director, Andrei Prokhorov. There's some superficial similarity in their gameplay loops too, but also plenty of places where they diverge emphatically. As experiences, they are very different, but they are both Ukrainian, and that's more significant than I appreciated at first. But to say that this is a Ukrainian game is to make a statement that's almost completely devoid of meaning to a Western audience, myself included. Where a Ukrainian audience might see allegory and allusion in the architecture, art design, and narrative, we see only a straightforward story about adventure, friendship, and sacrifice. As a game designer, how could you possibly hope to communicate all that context in your art? And yet these games aren't just art, they're also products. Products translated into English and sold for consumption by a Western audience as much as a Central European one. At the end of the day, as someone playing or reviewing this game, the best you can do is to be aware of the context and to respect it. This is a story told to you in good faith by people with a language, history, and culture different from your own. I played through Metro Exodus twice on the hardcore difficulty level. Difficulty affects not only the enemy AI, but also the availability of resources, such as ammunition and crafting materials. There is one additional tier of difficulty, Ranger Hardcore, but unlike the other difficulty modes, you're only able to select it at the beginning of a playthrough, after which it can't be changed. It hides the UI completely, so you have to already be comfortable with the controls. One of the first things you'll notice is the way Artyom moves. There's a kind of deliberate weight and presence to it. I don't dislike it in principle, it's in the vein of a tactical shooter. There is a problem though. Artyom is incapable of navigating even small obstacles in the terrain. It's a legibility issue. Places that look accessible are often not. It feels unnatural when you start the game, and more than 60 hours in, it still feels unnatural. You're also unable to go prone to reduce your exposed surface area and provide stability when aiming. In practice, this was less of an issue. Environmental design tends to de-emphasize sniping. What I missed more was tactical leaning around corners. This is a point of difference with the Stalker games, as well as tactical shooters more generally. It limits your options. Given Metro's emphasis on close-quarter engagements and stealth, this felt like a missed opportunity. I would have used this all the time had it been available. Strafing out from behind good cover, giving away my position, felt wrong. Artyom can carry 3 guns, various types of ammunition, and a small number of consumables, such as grenades, Molotov cocktails, and throwing knives. The level of detail on the weapons is impressive. 4A explicitly went out of their way to make sure that each was mechanically believable, built up from parts that looked like they could reasonably perform their designated function. For much of the game, you're required to carry the Tikhar in one of your 3 weapon slots. One of the earliest weapons you'll get in the game, the Tikhar is a pneumatic piece that fires ordinary ball bearings at high velocity. They don't have a lot of stopping power, but they're good for headshots, dead quiet, and cheap. There are also conventional firearms, fictional but recognisable. A revolver, 2 types of shotgun, various assault rifles, and a bolt-action rifle. There are a few others I won't spoil. The signature crafting element in Exodus is the weapon modification system. The characteristics of each weapon can be substantially, even radically, altered by swapping out the stock, barrel, sight, clip, and other attachments. You can find new attachments either on story missions or by diligently exploring your surroundings. But I think the flexibility and ambition of this system is undermined by other design decisions. While some modifications involve clear trade-offs, for the most part there's a sense that as you unlock additional parts, they're simply better. Longer barrels, for example, provide superior accuracy and damage at distance, but don't incur the handling penalty you might expect. A rifle with a 45-round clip doesn't feel materially more difficult to handle than one with a 10-round clip. I would have liked greater aim-down sights and time to focus penalties on the longer barrels, along with more pronounced movement and turning penalties for heavier or bulkier weapons. Given that you can be killed in just a few shots on higher difficulty, facility with a Tikhar is essential. It's a natural complement to stealth, producing less sound than even other silenced weapons. I continued to underestimate it until the back end of my first playthrough, even as upgrades made it more effective. Crafting Tikhar ammunition is cheap. It's also the only ammunition you can craft without a workbench. It really comes into its own on higher difficulty levels with more aggressive AI and limited crafting resources. Unsilenced gunfire will draw enemies towards you, if you're outside, from hundreds of meters away. So far, in fact, that you'll question how useful they are. There is a time and place for traditional ballistic weapons, but embracing the Tikar as your principal tool will allow you to control your engagements. In the tradition of Stalker, shotguns are essential for disposing of mutants. Along with the compulsory Tikar, that leaves you with just one slot to fill at your complete discretion. I found that submachine guns were too underpowered to be effective, and as I said, sniping is discouraged. I found that I wanted something to break out when things turned hot, situations where the Tikar and shotgun are too slow. For me, that was either an 8-round revolver or an assault rifle. In practice, I ended up alternating as they use different types of scarce ammunition. So what looks like extensive variety at first is in practice less compelling. I felt on both playthroughs that it deteriorated into min-maxing. The problem is compounded by the fact that you can trivially swap weapon attachments in the field, and that all discovered attachments are available to you at all times. Executive producer John Block has said that 4A specifically wanted players to have this flexibility, the ability to change loadouts on the fly to suit a given situation. Some people might like that, but I didn't feel like I agonized over my weapon choices. You don't have to live with hard trade-offs or improvise with mismatched weaponry. I wanted to be made to live with the consequences of my choices. There are a couple of nitpicks too. The closed reflex is the most flexible sight in the game, perfect for engagements at a variety of ranges, but it's available for use only with a small subset of weapons, leaving you with nothing in the 0 to 4x magnification range on assault rifles and the revolver, amongst others. Once engaged in a fight, enemies can take considerable punishment. If you catch them unaware, however, a single headshot will do the trick. It's a nice touch, but undermined by the fact that helmets seem to offer enemies no protection in this relaxed state. A single headshot with even the pneumatic Tikar is enough to kill most enemies. I would have liked helmets to be more effective, potentially entirely foreclosing headshots for some weapons or enemy types. Stealth plays a big part in Metro Exodus. Your comrades regularly remind you to spare innocents and refrain from killing where possible, and your actions will affect the narrative. You can forego stealth if you want, of course, damn the narrative consequences, but there are some good gameplay reasons for it too. On higher difficulties, in particular, you can be killed with just a couple of shots. It pays to be cautious, and stealth allows you to control the terms of an engagement. A good stealth system has to be legible and fair. You need consistently readable signals and the ability to act on them without being frustrated by poor design choices or bugs. As far as I know, there's no detailed public account from the developers on how stealth works in Exodus. We can piece together a fairly detailed picture from reviews, forums, and testing. This is a complex system that takes into account line of sight, occlusion, direct and indirect lighting, sound, player movement, enemy type, and game difficulty setting. It builds on the earlier Metro games, bringing greater realism and challenge. The starting point is whether you're directly lit. You can tell by glancing at the light meter on your wrist. If you're directly lit, within an enemy's line of sight and unoccluded, you'll be detected, regardless of whether you're moving or making any sound. However, on higher difficulties, you can be detected even in the absence of direct light if the enemy is close enough, or if you're moving without using the walk button, even when crouched. On higher difficulties, enemies can hear silenced gunshots if sufficiently close. You can draw their attention by throwing cans. This worked consistently for me, although there were reports of it being bugged in earlier builds. In-game explanatory text suggests that targeting lasers are visible to enemies, but I was never detected like this. Enemies react to your torch being on, and human enemies will come to investigate if they notice you extinguish an environmental light source. They'll also notice knocked out or dead bodies on the ground. Then they'll break their patrol and begin a search. I was impressed with the stealth system in Exodus. It felt legible, fair, and fun right through to the end of my second playthrough. Combat AI varies first depending on enemy type, as you might expect. Mutants display animalistic group intelligence. They will circle you, swarm, and rush you, but I was surprised to see that they'll also retreat if you manage to drop a number of their pack in quick succession. I found this behaviour in particular to be eerily realistic. It doesn't happen every time, it only seemed to happen when I was doing a good job. Lots of headshots or perhaps a high number of kills in a short time. The exact mechanism was hidden from me, which made it all the more convincing. Behaviour varies between mutant types too. Smaller, less capable mutants behave very differently from larger, more physically dominant ones. Humans in combat are pretty smart, although on the whole the illusion was less convincing. They're decent shots and do a reasonable job of finding and shooting from cover. Unfortunately, they frequently leave body parts exposed, making them easy targets. It's hard to say whether they're effective flankers. Many of the indoor spaces are too linear for flanking. Occasionally they'll burst from concealment to attack with a melee weapon, although this is scripted, not systemic. Backup will be drawn by the sound of gunfire, although this is where you run into the most disappointing aspect of the combat AI. It's often possible to cheese a fight with a group of humans by waiting behind cover for enemies in the vicinity to be drawn to the sound of gunfire, one by one and easy to pick off. Combat can be challenging, mainly in scenarios where you're overwhelmed by sheer numbers. On balance though, I would have liked to have been a bit more challenged in firefights with humans. It's a shame that Ranger Hardcore requires that you play without a UI. Exodus has both self-contained linear levels and open-world maps. There's a kind of late-game lurch away from open-world design. You get the sense that either 4A had reservations about committing to it, or perhaps ran up against funding constraints. It's a shame because for me these were the strongest parts of the experience. Main story missions are given to you by your crew. They involve a mix of stealth, combat and exposition, and are compulsory. You can't advance the narrative without completing them. On my first playthrough, I thought these missions didn't have fail states. You can die of course, but frequent autosave means this isn't punitive. But in fact, how you behave on the story missions does impact the narrative. On the open world maps, it's up to you whether you want to take on the next story mission or go off and explore for points of interest. That choice allows you to control the pacing in a way that builds investment in the experience. You can locate side missions or points of interest using your binoculars. Although technically optional, you don't want to miss them. Some of them affect the narrative and many have interesting and unique setups. They also lead to new weapon attachments and bits of environmental storytelling such as journal entries and cassettes. There's no procedural mission generation.
Because Metro is a handcrafted experience. Everything placed, everything set up in the scene along the player's way is always made it by hand.
You can really tell. Nothing feels copy-pasted or the result of some procedural quirk. Nothing feels like gap filler. Your time is respected. Every mission, story and side is handcrafted. Every object and enemy placed just so in the environment. The benefits of this approach are plain to see. It gives the embedded narrative in Exodus a rare cohesion. But there are trade-offs too. When you insist on a high degree of authorial control, a handcrafted experience, you foreclose on avenues for emergent narrative. The Exodus experience is defined by the story written by 4A Games. That's an intentional design decision on their part and one that I respect. But I also felt like there was a tension between that and player engagement in the moment-to-moment gameplay. Harvey Smith, creative director at Arcane Studios and co-creative director on the Dishonored games. Games exist in their most alive state when their adjacent systems have an influence on one another, driven by player action. Game systems that, even beyond the plans and intentions of the designers, allow the player to improvise, not with a single dominant strategy, but along multiple parallel tracks that can be chosen for tactical or expressive reasons, are the way to grant players the most powerful intellectual and emotional experiences the medium can offer. It also impacts replayability. Not all games need to be replayable, of course, but if you de-emphasize a systems-based approach to storytelling, that inherently affects replayability, even with two different endings on offer. Much as I enjoyed my second playthrough, there was an indelible sameness to the experience, right down to enemy placement during some encounters. The linearity of the architecture used in mission locations also felt like a missed opportunity. I understand the desire to guide the player through the environment and control the narrative experience, but I'm not sure that linear missions require literally linear architecture. Even missions set in exterior locations can feel like they're on rails. A corollary of this approach is that there aren't usually multiple ways to approach a mission. There's little mission planning required in advance other than perhaps the decision to approach it day or night, and few opportunities to improvise in mission. On the harder modes, crafting resources are scarce, but the game always ensures you have enough on story missions. It felt like there was no need to gear up beforehand and no need to be concerned during the mission. I'm not going to talk about the story beats, but I do want to talk about the qualities of the tale being told. The English voiceover work is mixed. I switched to Russian voice acting with subtitles, so that's all I can speak to. I found the dialogue a bit saccharine, and conversations often feel stilted. But what I think comes through above all else, and what ultimately makes the story a success, is a tenderness and affection for its characters. By the end of the tale, you're invested in these characters. You've just shared a train journey across Russia. The weirdest artistic choice, for me, was the decision to make Artyom completely silent in-game. Sharing a smoke with an old friend, or intimate moments with Anna, Artyom's silence hangs heavy in the air. Such obvious care was taken to sketch out the small moments between characters too, like Tokarev showing Nastya how to fix a rifle strap, or the flirting between Katya and Stepan. We do have some insight into why it was done this way though, in response to a question about why we never see Artyom's face.
That's because Artyom is mostly a container for the player to imagine himself be occupying. Artyom's face could detract from player being able to imagine himself.
I don't think these things are incompatible with having Artyom be fully voiced. You have tight control over the narrative and a fixed and limited number of story branches. Having Artyom actively engage in conversations would have added to the characterization. On the other hand, the narrative and gameplay systems do work together to ensure consistency between what the story is telling us about Artyom and what Artyom is doing in-game. Through 2 playthroughs, Artyom's story felt like a credible product of his in-game choices. I enjoyed my first playthrough of Exodus, but had some doubts. It wasn't until partway through the second playthrough that I understood them. Sid Meier, co-founder of Microprose, game design luminary and currently director of creative development at Firaxis, famously said, "A game is a series of interesting decisions." But I also like this, from Harvey Smith again. People want to play games that enable them to make a series of interesting decisions, but they want these games to be grounded in an emotionally evocative setting. You personally might want less embedded narrative or a different flavour, but that's a matter of taste. Having some concrete identification with the subjects and subject matter found in video games grants those games universal entry points as an aid to learning or emotional attachment, and thus gravity, meaning or importance. With Metro Exodus, I think 4A nailed the second part. But for me, the degree of authorial control over the experience limited the opportunities to make interesting decisions. So what's an interesting decision in the context of game design? That's a big topic and everyone will have their own view. But in the context of Exodus, I'd like to paraphrase something Sid Meier said, and which I feel to be true. Interesting decisions should be consequential and involve trade-offs. Exodus didn't really force me to make trade-offs, and the consequences of my decisions were constrained mainly to the narrative question of good ending versus bad ending. Weapon balance issues, the ability to redesign weapons in the field, weapon attachments without clear cons to match their pros, plentiful resources on story missions, linear architecture and mission design, including static enemy placement. These things undermined the sense that I was being called upon to make interesting decisions. But I want to reiterate something that I said earlier, that the starting point for understanding a game in context should be its own ambition. 4A set out to make a handcrafted narrative experience. They succeeded, even though I might personally have preferred less embedded narrative or a different flavour. Moreover, as I came to appreciate, there is a complete absence of cynicism in the way this game is put together. It is so obviously a labour of love. 4A made the game they wanted to make. I really enjoyed it and I hope my enthusiasm comes across. I commend Metro Exodus to you wholeheartedly.